The man in yellow already knew that Julie was going to be there because of what happened in this moment. And this is something that has completely flown past the heads of most people in this community, despite the fact that in this scene we are given extremely obvious evidence by the writers that the man in yellow was clearly waiting for Julie to make her appearance before doing anything to Jim Matthews. Like, notice how he was clearly already waiting in the shadows, but he only chooses to reveal himself once Julie has already shown up, and it's only then that he proceeds with his attack on Jim Matthews.
That was a hell of a song. That Jade sure can play. Get out of here. Run.
The reason why this matters so much is that it's one of the biggest clues that Julie being here at this specific moment in time is something that was pre-arranged by the entity controlling the monsters, because he knew that Julie being there would force Jim Matthews into a confrontation with the man in yellow. And I want you to pay very close attention to how the man in yellow only reveals himself after Julie has already made an appearance. What we're seeing here is very clear evidence that this scenario that we were witnessing at this moment was deliberately designed and planned for by the entity in control of the monsters. Like, if you really think Martin specifically telling Julie to leave the dungeon and then the entity in control of the monsters just coincidentally happens to use a story walking Julie to trap Jim Matthews in this incident, then I don't know what to tell you, because there's so many overwhelming signs that literally all of what we're seeing here was planned by the entity to guarantee that Jim Matthews would not survive his encounter with the man in yellow. But something else that is never talked about in regards to this moment is how the entity intentionally sets everything up in such a way as to maximize Jim Matthews' suffering.
No, I can't.
I don't understand. Please talk to me.
I need some time, honey.
Even after all of this time, I've never seen anyone truly analyze and explain what was really happening in this scene. Because to me, it's obvious that it was all planned in a way that would maximize the suffering that Jim Matthews felt right before he died. And there is so much evidence to support this claim. Like the fact that people cannot see that the entity clearly organized everything in such a way that Tabitha would abandon Jim Matthews for the second time in a row right before the man in yellow took him out. And this is crazy to me that people cannot see this. The yellow man literally praises Jade's ability to play the violin right before he takes out Jim Matthews. And this is one of the biggest clues that the entity in control of the monsters wanted Jade to play the violin at the bottle tree. It was always a trap. But what's most important here is that the entity knew in advance that Tabitha would abandon Jim Matthews yet again when things got tough. Because that's the same exact thing that she did when the baby fell off the changing table, which was also obviously caused by the entity as a ploy to remove Jim Matthews' influence from her life. But even now, people cannot see this obvious truth, that the entity was doing everything he could to maximize the amount of pain that Jim Matthews would feel right before he got taken out.
This didn't have to happen. I did try to warn you.
Get off him! No, I can't.
I don't understand. Please talk to me.
I need some time, honey.
Like, do you really think it's a coincidence that right before the man in yellow shows up to take out Jim Matthews, that his wife just happens to abandon him and their relationship yet again? This was obviously not an accident. Just like Julie being there is something that was designed on purpose, not only to make sure that Jim Matthews would not run, but to give him that final gut punch of not even knowing if Julie would survive before he got taken out. All of what we were seeing here was by design. The entity wanted Jim Matthews feeling completely powerless and weak right before he died. The entity in control control of the monsters wanted to ensure that Jim Matthews felt like a total and utter failure before he was killed by the man in yellow. But this directly brings me to a certain moment that we saw with Julie.
Thank you. You need to leave.
This scene here directly ties into what was happening with Julie during Jim Matthews' encounter with the man in yellow, because it is clear that without the entity taking advantage of Julie's ability to storywalk, he would have never been able to kill Jim Matthews. But one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that it was obviously Julie who saves Randall after the trap in the ambulance. After all, the writers spent an uncomfortable amount of time focusing on Randall teaching her how to drive. And so it's obvious that a story-walking Julie is the person who somehow saved his life after Boyd made that deal with the devil to trade Randall for the people trapped in the ambulance. But Randall was actually unconscious when the ambulance was brought back to Colony House, so he doesn't know that it was Julie that saved him. However, it's more than clear to me that the entity specifically took advantage of Julie's ability to kill Jim Matthews, because he wouldn't be able to get to him any other way.
You know why the phone is off the wall? Voice on the other end said his name was Thomas. Something here knows things about us, and it knows which buttons to push.
Whoa, slow down. Is this Jim Matthews? Your wife shouldn't be digging that hole, Jim.
The entity has relentlessly studied the people of this town, and he knows exactly what makes them tick. But that also means that he knows exactly what they are afraid of.
Hello? Mom's in an ambulance. You have to help her.
What is this? Who are you talking to?
Hi, Jim.
You leave my children alone.
But they're not your children anymore.
In the case of Jim Matthews, the entity knew that Jim is not afraid of the Nightwalkers or the music box. Heck, Jim isn't afraid of the man in yellow. But what is he really afraid of? It's losing his family. That's why the man in yellow mentions his wife on the radio, and it's why the dead baby on the telephone was threatening his wife in the ambulance. The entity knows that once he threatens Jim Matthews' family, it causes him to lose all rationality. He knows that once he threatens Jim Matthews' family, that's the only time that Jim Matthews becomes vulnerable to the entity's manipulations. Like, it's no coincidence that right before he gets taken out, his wife left him yet again. And Julie just happens to show up. What a coincidence. And then bam, the man in yellow. Like, all of this was designed. None of this is happening by chance. The entity wanted to ensure that Jim Matthews suffers as much as possible before he was taken out. Like, he just coincidentally fails to save his marriage, then he just coincidentally fails to prevent the man in yellow from killing or possibly torturing his child. None of this was an accident. What happened to Jim Matthews on this day was truly a horrific tragedy, and it was designed by a completely sick, twisted, and demonic entity. But the entity is not the only one who completely disrespected Jim Matthews on that day. It was also the writers, the people who defiled the amazing character that he used to be in the first season of the show and transformed him into a much more inferior caricature of what he used to be right before killing him off and tossing him aside like a piece of trash. Because let's be honest here, in the third season of this show, the incredibly intellectual and questioning side of his personality that was determined to fight back against this place and its demons completely disappeared. And it's a damn shame, because if they don't bring him back to life and give him a continuously relevant position in the plot, then there was no point to this character whatsoever, except of course, as is the case for all of the other useless characters, of which there is obviously an abundance of in this story, is to extend the runtime of the show. Because when you insert a character into a story and make him this prominent, that comes with expectations. And Jim Matthews as a character has not fulfilled the expectations created by the same writers themselves who decided to kill him off in this completely ridiculous way and at a much earlier point in the story than you would expect from a character like this. But oh well, I guess the brilliant minds writing this story think that Marielle, Fatima, Acosta, and of course Ellis are adding more to the story than Jim Matthews. Oh wow. But the reason why the entity clearly despises Jim Matthews so much is actually more complicated than you might think. So watch this video next.